some interesting application. Okay.
All right. And
Okay. Super.
All right.
Hey, good.
Should I introduce?
Please,
I'll
if
make
you
an
want.
introduction. So
Just short.
I
Yeah.
welcome Sandy Pentland. He's a professor at the Media Lab. He's had a very diverse and adventurous career. He started his career in 90s as a pioneer in machine learning and machine vision. And if you didn't know, in the 90s, he was working on a product that pretty much looked like Google Glass that came out 20 years later. After that, he started looking into group dynamics and how members of different groups work together, and that project, that research led to this device called sociometric badges that I learned recently that NASA is using in its project to understand interaction between astronauts. But most of you probably know him because he wrote this famous paper that coined the term computational social science with David Lazar at Northeastern. On top of many problems that are popular in computational social science, he's also interested in a lot of startups and development companies that with the aim of mainly data and development. With that introduction, I'll give the floor to Sandy.
Super. Thanks. Hey. So as Iman's, usually I walk around a lot, but I'm not going to do that because I'm told that there's a camera, right? So I do a lot of different things, which means you can ask me questions that are very broad, okay? So I helped set up the Media Lab, helped set up this new Institute for Data Systems and Society here. I'm on the board of directors of the Sustainable Development Global Partnership, because I'll tell you a little bit about that. I run a number of things at the World Economic Forum, and I've been on advisory boards for Google, where I told them that they should break up and become Alphabet. And they did, but now they're going the wrong way. And AT&T, where I chaired their big data board on privacy and how to handle data more safely, Telefonica. And I also advise the EU, Beijing, and Colombia, among others. So we're putting together, for instance, IT strategy for Colombia right now and helping Beijing with that. So as Iman said, a long time ago, we investigated what the future would be like by building these PCs that were powered by motorcycle batteries, and we would strap them to students for long periods of time, like years, right? And they would run around and find out what it would like to have computation on your body, because this was before there were cell phones and before there was wireless. There was no cell phones. There was no Wi-Fi, right? And so it was like ham radio, little sort of lasers that shot stuff in your eye, all that sort of stuff. And everybody thought it was really cool because you could, see maps immediately and you could communicate with people and you could search the web and stuff like that. And everybody said I would never wear it. So I started collaborations with fashion schools, and this is one of them. This is from the sort of early mid-90s. And the fashion students, the charge was, we have this technology coming, what will it look like? What will people actually do? And they designed something that looks all the world like an iPhone, fingerprint reader. I thought it was stupid. Now we have it. Flat screens, that was obvious that was going to happen. The Google Glass thing is that thing up in the other corner. The guy that was sort of in charge of that went on to actually be the technical lead for Google Glass. In doing this, we invented the term augmented reality. That was Thad Starner, one of my students. So we were doing stuff. But the part that was most interesting and surprising was the data. The fact that suddenly we had, millisecond by millisecond data of where everybody was, if they were talking, how they were moving, what they were texting. And that was sort of shocking, right? Because all the things that we know about social science and economics and so forth comes from these very small information sources. Lab experiments, census data, not a lot of depth there, right? And most of it's for weird people. Does everybody know what a weird person is? Okay, so Western, educated, rich, blah, blah, blah. You guys, okay? And there's even basic visual phenomena, visual illusions that are not shared between weird people like us and 9/10 of humanity. So what else is not shared? Well, it could be lots of things. So what we know about humans is limited to this this fairly narrow group, which is sort of shocking. Anyhow, the thing about the data led to battles in my research group over privacy, for instance. And so I wrote a paper called The New Deal on Data, which argued that people ought to own their own data in a certain sense. It's ownership rights, it's not ownership. That's absolutely critical if you're a lawyer. You may not care. It just means that you get to say what happens to it, informed consent, opt-in, not opt-out, ability to have data portability. And I co-led a group at the World Economic Forum that included the Justice Minister of the EU, the Chairman of the US Federal Trade Commission, the CTO of Microsoft, et cetera, and what people tell me is that's where GDPR got started, okay? Because the core things that we came up with as recommendations, which are actually in my paper way back in the day, actually are the core of GDPR still. So feel good, right? Did something, it's still a work in progress. I was telling you about the night that they actually approved the bill. In the EU, countries can add clauses to bills without debate at the very end. And something like 10 different countries added clauses which contradicted the basic thrust of it and each other. And it was a mess, but they're sorting it out. As Iman mentioned, one of the other things I did somewhat later is with David Lazar. We wrote this paper. And we did a little conference. About a third of those people were my students, former students, but you see a lot of pretty famous people there. And we convinced Science to print this, and lots of people have picked up the name, right? And you see academic units all over trying to take advantage of the fact that suddenly it's not data poverty, it's huge amounts of data. But it's not data built to order to answer scientific social questions. It's proxies for things. So you have to be a little more creative in how you use it. You have to be a little more careful. So my very first job is relevant. It's like I do just now what I did all my life. My first job was counting beavers from outer space. So you say, well, how do you do that? Well, the resolution is about 1 acre, so you can't possibly see beavers, but you can see beaver lakes. And it turns out the number of beavers is proportional to the number of lakes, so you can count beavers in Canada from outer space. And that's sort of what I do today and what many of you people are doing, proxies. A lot of my students have gone on and done things, this list, yay. So we've been pretty successful at this. I guess Abdullah came and talked just recently. One of the things that we did after that is I partnered with Orange and the World Economic Forum to run a series of big academic trials. And what we did is we talked to countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Italy, England, Senegal, into taking their telco data, all their government data, et cetera, aggregating it into things that look a little like census data, and releasing it for academics to figure out what you can do with it. So we've had 4 or 5 of those now, where we would bundle this data together. Academic units would propose something to do with it. If they got approved, they would get access to the data, they would write their paper, it would get reviewed by an ethics committee, and then we would have a conference, right? It's called Data for Development. That's the main conference that we put together. And Data Pop is another one, NetMob is another one that came out of that, and there was an NGO called Data Pop that does things like that. Anyhow, this was surprisingly effective. So together with a couple of friends, we were able to lobby the UN when they were putting together the Sustainable Development Goals to include computational social science measures in the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There's something like 169 indicators, most of which are proxies for things like inequality, poverty, et cetera, sustainability of the environment and things like that. And what's really unique about this is, first of all, a real application of computational social science. People don't know how to do many of these. We were able to show that you could do some. We were able to argue that you could do others. And right now, quietly, national statistical offices around the world are working out how they're going to measure these indicators of poverty, inequality, et cetera, using the data from things like telcos, banks, satellites, and other sources, which they've never done before. I count that as sort of a big success because basically until really begins happening, most of what happens in terms of international policy is just hot air. I mean, I'm sorry, but people say, yeah, that's a good idea, but you don't know if they're actually doing it. There's no data, right? You can't hold their feet to the fire and say, you didn't do it, right? So as they begin measuring things, as this becomes standardized, you can begin figuring out what policies work and which ones don't. Yay! Why will anybody pay attention to this? Because people like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank condition the interest they charge on the indicators. So if you've got a country that has broad inequality, that means you're less likely to pay back a loan that the World Bank gives you, right? So they charge you a little more money. That means there's a little less you can skim off the top. No, sorry. Right? It means that there's a feedback loop. Now, it's just nascent. I'm not saying this is the way the world works, but there's indications that a lot of people want it to work this way, okay? So, quick questions? No? Okay. There are problems with this. Reliability, privacy. This is data about you. I mean, taken the wrong direction, this is 1984 on steroids, right? There's utility. Are these proxies any good? Can you actually do stuff with it, right? Security. Countries worry about other people using this in negative ways against them. Fairness, bias, etc. And that's what we do in my group. We think about these sorts of things. So the next thing, so I'm just going to go through these, okay? And I'm going to go through them quick, okay? Just so you get a sense. Many of these things you may have seen, some of them you may not. This next one, I suspect you have not, and it's one of my current hobby horses. So we all know about randomized controlled trials, right? What happens if you do a randomized controlled trial? It shows causality, right? Wrong. In physics, maybe. And the reason is that if you have hidden causal variables that you have not controlled for, it only takes a few of those to get you a very substantial false alarm rate. Now, those things can also not just be independent causes, they can be things in a chain. So for instance, look at cellular metabolism. It's a whole set of proteins that result in the thing that you're controlling for, right? But maybe one of them is way out of whack, and without doing anything, that will propagate up that chain and cause a big change. And so you ask, well, what are the odds of the treatment and the control just happening the way you think it should happen, but because of these other things that you haven't controlled for? It's very substantial. Now, statistics is finally sort of catching up to this. They're called confounders. There's papers about deconfounders. It's not solved, okay? So what do? Well, this is why in the medical literature they have meta-analysis. Because if you look at these things and you have lots and lots of experiments, so you get tens of thousands of examples, then you can begin to discount these hidden causal variables, okay? And this looks like Kolmogorov complexity arguments, if you're familiar with those, right? In literatures where they don't have a lot of data, They call this consilience, so anthropology, things like that, where it's asking, is there a causal process that accounts for many disparate experiments? Because if they're disparate, that means that they're probably not correlated with each other, and it's not perfect, but you can build up a more probability from fewer experiments if the experiments are truly very different. Okay? Here's an even worse thing. Most of the variables you deal with are long-tailed. That's because of, right, these sort of cascade behaviors you see all the time. That's one of the main things you study, right? But with long-tailed distributions, things that are called alpha stable, the mean is not defined. And in really alpha stable ones, the variance is not defined. Go look at all the equations that you use. They use the mean and the variance. What that means is when you take something that's an alpha stable distribution, a long-tail distribution, and you sample it, you can get dramatically different means each time you make a sample. So you could draw two samples and they look very much the same. The next one could be dramatically different. So when you put that in the framework of RCTs, you say, well, I did this and this, they look the same, now I'm going to treat them. Now let's look again. Well, the means could be dramatically different, not because you did anything, but just because your draw was slightly different. So one of the things we've been doing is doing math for this. We have a new paper that, yay, it's at ICHCAI. Abi Dubny is the guy that sort of led this. He's real good at the statistics stuff. So we now have methods of dealing with long-tail distributions that are dramatically better than what people traditionally use. However, even the optimal methods require hugely more samples than you're typically used to using. Okay? Just little word of warning. If you're interested, I can send out the paper. A second thing is, so that's one topic. Okay? It's real fast. Is it okay? Okay. Second topic is privacy. You probably deal with individual level data. So probably most of what you do is stuff that's publicly available. So people have decided to post it, perhaps stupidly. But if you want to deal with actual behavior, what did they buy? Where did they go? That's very private data. And you have to say, what can we do to protect privacy? Anonymization does not work. Okay, this is anonymization. So we've done a number of papers. We had a very high profile thing in Science about this. 4 observations let you attack it with other data to re-identify things in most cases, at least for mobility data. So we did a study with the UN about what you needed to do to get a good trade-off between privacy and utility. Because, of course, if you aggregated it down to a single number, that's, of course, quite private, right? But completely useless, or almost useless. And it turned out that in this thing, census resolution, so aggregating both in space and time so that you have, say, order 50 people, trimming so that you don't get any outliers like a Bill Gates, right? And you don't get any blocks that are less than say, your criteria 50, is really quite good. And for many applications, and now we're talking about government applications where they're building a road or something like that, that level of aggregation is good. And that's why the census is set up to do that way. A thing I didn't mention is at the very first slide, I had this book called Social Physics. So what's that? So social physics is the old name for what you do. So at the time when natural science was becoming physics and alchemy was becoming chemistry, there was this idea of using statistics to understand culture, human culture. And they called that social physics because they were envious of the physicists, right? And it came up in France and then spread to England. And didn't get very far because they didn't have a lot of data, and statistical methods were just being invented at the beginning of the 1800s. And so you guys should be picking that up and moving forward. That's one way to think about that, okay? So the census level stuff is really interesting, just to go back to that. I'll go back here. Ooh, sorry. Okay, so when you're thinking about building a system for government, for a country, you have a bunch of things that you want to think about. You want utility, you want it to work, you want it to protect privacy, you want it to be secure. You also want people to understand what's going on. You need informed consent. Like that's really the key of GDPR is your average human should understand, at least in a good sort of honest qualitative way, what's being done with data that originated from their behavior, okay? And the census has a great advantage because we've been doing it for 150 years and people pretty much have the idea, right? And they pretty much have the idea that it's pretty safe, and it is. So it's a good way to start. Now you might want to do more fine-grained things in some situations, but when you talk about the UN building indicators, countries building indicators, starting this way is like the sort of least contentious way to do it. And you want to make that data open, which is, of course, if it protects privacy appropriately, you can actually publish the data, this aggregated census level data. So it's got cool, right? But there's this utility question. What can you do with that sort of data that looks like computational social science, okay? So let me show you some things about that. In the previous slide, what we were doing is asking experts, well, here's some data, we showed them different resolutions, and we just asked them, how good is this for your purposes, you know, for transportation or public health? And you got this nice Pareto curve. So this is Alejandro Noriega, who will come up later, was the guy that led this. So what were those experts seeing, and could we duplicate that? So the sort of thing that we do is we take telecoms data, finance data, social data, health data, government data, put it together in a sort of rich census-like thing, okay? And I like to refer to these as not just neighborhood level things, but also what I call social bridges, because after all, this is social science, right? So a typical representation that I'm going to show you has both, you know, how many people live here, how much money do they spend, but also what other neighborhoods do they work in or shop in. And those bridges talk about patterns of interaction between populations, okay? So I'll call it social bridge. People like that name. Okay? It's not the only way you can do it, but if you're going to restrict yourself to this sort of census-like data, and you're going to protect privacy and security, this is a good way to go, right? And you can show that this is still maintaining a lot of the privacy characteristics, okay? So we've done a bunch of things with this. We've done tourism planning. This is in Andorra. They were interested in, well, if we put on this sort of event, where do people go in the country afterwards? So you're looking at movements of population. You're correlating that with congestion on the roads, with spending in the hotels, things like that. And you can sort of map out what different types of events are good for Andorra without reference to individual data. Okay, so what happens there, just so you understand it, is the telco aggregate, who has this data, because everybody has a cell phone, right? They aggregate the data, we don't see it, right? And they say, here's how many people were there in the morning. And you say, where did they go? Well, 40% of them went there in the afternoon. 10% of them went over there. Right? You don't get percentages that result in a single person, or even a small number of people. Right? Here's an example from Senegal. So we put this together with Orange and a number of other partners. And we packaged it up, and we had almost 100 academic units around the world ask what you could do with it. And they showed that that type of data is adequate for estimating poverty levels, inequality, looking for optimizing transport, for figuring out where you're going to invest money to electrify, and for public health. Because, of course, people moving is one of the main ways of spreading infectious disease. Okay. This is something that Abdullah did. I thought I'd throw it in. So this is in Riyadh. They have persistent unemployment problems. So they spend a lot of money on educating people, but some people have a very hard time getting jobs. And they've done all sorts of things for almost 20 years to try and figure that out, because demographically they're not different. But what is true in Riyadh is people tend to stay put. They don't move around a lot. And some places have good public transportation and some places don't. So if you don't have your own private car, remember that women have a hard time driving around in Riyadh, right? If you have to rely on public transportation, not having public transportation is a real barrier to getting employed. So this is in the category of duh, but you know, it took them a long time to figure this out. Okay, right? So I hope you're getting the idea that there are these sort of flows of people and interaction between different communities that account for a lot of the evolution of social variables, I guess is the way to say it. So let me show you some very recent stuff that I'm excited about. Now, what I'm going to show you is not necessarily causal, but you remember what I said about RCTs at the beginning. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to find a whopping big effect and explore it from many points of view, find natural experiments, do RCTs when we can, it's often difficult, and build up a whole sort of body of evidence about what's going on. And so what you're seeing here, I'm going to talk to you about the growth of GDP in cities, which is an important topic, believe me, right? You have poor neighborhoods, you want them to get richer. How do you do that? You could educate them, you could do many things. Let me show you some other things you could do. So this is data from Istanbul, New York, and Beijing, all three, okay? And what you see is it's well known that, for instance, population density has to do with GDP. It's more people, you make more money, right? It has a mild effect on growth over time. Education levels, investment levels have effects on that. But we're going to control for all of those things that you know about. And we're just going to look at diversity. Now, diversity in this case means, do the people who work in this neighborhood come from very different socioeconomic groups? So what is a socioeconomic group? That means they live in neighborhoods that are rich, poor, and in between. Okay? And there are other things that are correlated with those characteristics. So what's interesting is the diversity people entering a district has this very nice tight correlation with the diversity of shops in the data. Because remember, we have credit card data and we have mobility data. So we can say, who goes there and what are the shops that are there? Okay. Well, that's cool. Not too surprising, perhaps. But here's some more things. Year-on-year growth in GDP is predicted with a correlation of 0.7 with the diversity of goods and services, education level, stuff like that. So then it's only, well, it's about the same, about 0.7. And of course, it's going to be correlated equally with diversity of shops and services in the area. I just showed you that in the last one. Okay. So that's really sort of cool. So this is Beijing. So GDP, year-on-year GDP growth, right, is proportional to inter-neighborhood diversity. And this has a R square of 0.45 across 3 continents. So it's not strongly determined by sort of local culture type things, right? And that's useful. So you say, well, okay, so diversity of inter-neighborhood diversity. So what determines that? Well, clearly, this diversity of goods and services is part of it because it's very tightly correlated. But if you remember the Riyadh version, it has to do also with access to transportation. So a lot of the places that are poor just simply have poor transportation. Now, it's not causal in the straightforward of like, you do this, you get that. But it seems that there's this sort of constellation of things that you need to have. You need to have good transportation, you need to have some increased investment in diversity of services and places to be able to get the diversity of people, which provokes more investment. It's a sort of a feedback thing. It's the best guess. It's guess, right? It's an informed guess, but it's a guess. Okay? And so you can begin doing things like planning transportation, and this is from a group at Imperial, to increase GDP in specific neighborhoods. So this is an example of something they did where they were planning a subway line in London to increase GDP in some of the poorer neighborhoods. Okay? So that's really pretty cool. Okay? So now I'm going to get in trouble, and Iman's going to like yell at me because I don't do it quite. Where's Iman? Oh, there you go. Okay. So return on diversity is not equal. Okay, this is his work. And this is 100,000 people in South Asia. And I said that neighborhood diversity predicts year-on-year growth of income. It also turns out, and this is something that you may have seen in other places, is the diversity of interaction. So that could be diversity of the people you talk to or the places you go. Both of them work to some degree. Predicts income. But it's different for different status groups. So this is a country with castes, right? So we know what low castes are and high castes. And the same amount of diversity results in more gain for high caste people or high status people than low status people. You'll notice though that the scale here is pretty stretched. So, 0.925 to 0.975. So there's a big difference between high and low status, but that's the same as sort of the difference, the structural diversity of people, right? So this is so structural diversity of exposure to other people for rich people is about as important as this status variable in terms of income. Okay? Let me just qualitatively, I'm not making a causal claim here. The same thing is true in America and other cities. So this data is from the US, I think, but it also works in Europe. So these are socioeconomic deciles. So, poorest to richest. Richest is the 8 and 9. Poorest is the 1 and 0. And it's how much they share territory, right? So do the poor people hang out with the rich people when they're shopping? And the answer is no, not at all. Poor people hang out with poor people. Well, you might expect that, right? Rich people with rich people. The amusing thing is almost rich people like to shop in rich people, but not the other way around, right? But if you look at where they go, you also see this same banding. So that means, for instance, work is highly segregated. And if you look at what they tweet, you find, and this is like looking at all the hashtags and looking at the the first eigenvector, right? You can see that and asking what's the cosine distance between them. Right? You see that poor people talk about very different things than rich people. So there's this segregation in our society, right? It's a little like what you saw in this other place, and this is actually, same data. So this is looking at the first two eigenvectors of the hashtags and coloring them by income, so lower income, higher income. Poor people don't talk about the same thing as upper income people at all, right? It's a problem. Yes?
How do you merge in that data? Just curious.
What?
How do you merge in that income data with
So in this case, these are geolocated tweets, so we know where their home is, because they do a lot from there. Right? We know where they're going. Also. There's a couple different ways to do this, but that's what that particular data is. Right? So we just put up this site. This is led by Esteban Moro. Do people know him? He's a faculty member who's new here. I mean, he's been faculty member in Madrid for a long time. He's been working with us for a year, but he's going to be an IDSS starting the next year. Yay. So he led that along with one of my graduate students, and of course I help out. And we just did this Atlas of Inequality, which you should go and look at. And what it does is a different sort of aggregation. So I was talking about aggregation by neighborhood. Now we're going to do aggregation by store or site. Again, conceptually, it's the same type of thing. You ask for a particular store, how many people's cell phones spend at least 5 minutes in a row in that thing? And what was their home neighborhood? Same type of aggregation type of a thing. What you find is really interesting. So what you find, this is just outside. So there's Clover, right on Main Street, and Chipotle. So you see those little green bars. So those are income quartiles. So Clover, it's only rich people and a few poor people that go there. Okay? 25 meters away, you get Chipotle, almost the same price distribution for food, but it's extremely equal in terms of income that go there. Right? Interesting, okay? So let's look at all sorts of things. And again, this is Esteban is the lead guy here. So this is average segregation. So just to be clear, so we were talking about Clover being very segregated and Chipotle being not segregated in terms of mixing of incomes. So what are things that are mixing? Well, schools are highly segregated. Grocery stores are sort of middling. Factories and warehouses are very highly segregated. Office buildings, not as much. But there are weird things like Tex-Mex and ramen are very, very mixed. Everybody goes there. Whereas there are some things, I think sushi is one of them, which is highly segregated. And then terminal, that's airport terminal, convention centers, everybody goes there. So they're very desegregated. Now, remember what I was saying about how the physical mixing and the things that people talk about are highly correlated? This is disturbing. So, you can go back to this stuff here and say, oh my God, there is this segregation by income that's at a very fine grain, and what's important here is it's not neighborhood based, right? This is where you spend time. Why does that matter? Because about 3/4 of all people you're exposed to are people far away from your home. People commute to work, commute to shop, they go many kilometers, every city, right? So where you live might be segregated, but it also turns out where you shop and where you work is very segregated. So there's place segregation and home segregation, neighborhood segregation. Got it? It's different. And the estimate is about 2/3 of the segregation in our society is this place segregation and not the home residential segregation. 1/3 is that. The residential stuff. So just to sort of put that concretely, when let's see, are you guys rich or poor? I guess you guys are poor at the moment, right? So when you go out there, you're much more likely to go to, well, let's take somebody who's middle income. Some people like you go to Clover, but Chipotle, middle income people go there, but they never go to Clover, right? So they're standing there on the street and they make a choice about where to go. And the choice they make is to go to places that have people like them. And that's the root of most segregation by income in this country. Okay? Huh. So, let me see if I can, oh, I missed it. Well, whatever. Okay. So let's see, we have a couple more minutes. Let me do real quick. So this is what I end up spending a lot of my time at. Sorry about the font. So I run a research consortium here at MIT. It's called the Trusted Data Alliance, because all of this requires, if you're going to do stuff like this operationally, you need to be able to handle data securely and so forth. You had a question.
The difference between these two restaurants, would it be because of some confounders, like, because software is vegetarian, it might be that
Yeah.
your people are more vegetarian, and that causes them.
There's lots of confounders, but those confounders are highly correlated with income, for instance, right? So the key thing here, right, is that there is this segregation, however it comes about. I didn't say this was causal. I said that they're segregated. And what we see again and again and again is that people who don't physically mix have different discussions about how the world evolves. Okay? Could be because it's those damn vegetarians, right? Could be. I don't know. I don't think so, right? But so what the thing that's interesting is when we think about segregation, we think about residential segregation. That has one sort of solution, one types of solution. If you think about choice segregation, that could have very different sorts of ways of addressing it. So the mechanisms could be different, right? And just in general, conversations are not about the place segregation. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the types. So I'm thinking Chipotle versus an office building, for example. Both seem fairly homogeneous, but they also seem quite different. So let's say I'm at Chipotle and I have a meal. I might overhear conversations of people who are either much richer or much poorer than I am.
Exactly correct.
Versus if I go to an office building, you might see this homogeneity because there's some people who work in finance and some people who clean the offices of the people who work in finance. And so there you would see potentially very little interaction across those groups. So I'm wondering if there's a way to systematically think about what a homogeneous or what this diverse location might look like.
So that's a good question, right? I like that question. It gets at what you really care about, or what I would care about, is if you go to places that are non-segregated, does that change your opinion so that you're less polarized? Do you have more appreciation for people from these other income groups, and do they have appreciation of you? And there's many situations where that might not happen, and I think you just gave one, right? So that the cleaning people and the bankers probably buying food in the same place is not going to do too much. Chipotle, because it's more of a broad thing, you could see maybe more. But one thing we don't understand is how exposure to other people changes people's opinions. And we were talking about that before this began, is how can you drive people to be more informed about other people's concerns in a legitimate way and forge a broader thing, right? So that's a key question. And the part that's perhaps new here is that this is places where you could potentially do these interventions are everywhere. All the restaurants, all the public facilities, etc. Right? That's the part that might be interesting.
And we have a quick question from the live stream from Istanbul.
Yeah.
Maddie would like to know, in what countries are locations with neighborhood segregation studies conducted, and are there any noteworthy cross-cultural differences?
So the study of income growth was in Istanbul, in New York, and in Beijing, right? So that was diversity and growth. We've seen similar things with respect to probability of crime in neighborhoods, where change to be less diverse is fairly strongly predictive of increases in crime. This thing that you just saw was just US, okay? But one might expect similar things. Istanbul has, because we've operated in Istanbul, Istanbul has neighborhoods that are fairly dramatically different culturally. And those have correlates in income and so forth like that. And we haven't gone back and looked at it, but I would expect that you would see similar things there, right? Okay. Anyhow, so the Trust Data Consortium is us trying to promote a safer way to handle data that allows societies to use insights, to develop and use sites from computational social science, okay? And I like to joke, this is me wearing a suit and a tie, which you never see, okay? So the president of the EU asked me to come and lecture all of the ministers of the single digital market about how to handle data in the light of GDPR and with data localization, et cetera, okay? And the reason he did that is that at this opening, Estonia was the president, had held the presidency. And what we do is sort of like Estonia, so he liked that. But what's happened actually is that the EU Eurostat, which is the official statistics body for all of the EU, has adopted roughly this framework, okay? And so we work with them. The key insights, let me go back. First key insight is don't move data around. Leave data where it's collected for the purpose it's collected. In other words, you don't move telco data to different places. Instead, what you do is you ask questions of people and receive answers, okay? So I'll give you the quick joke. Quick joke is the military figured this out in about 1500. They kept putting all their troops behind a big wall, right? And they kept getting wiped out because someone would leave the door open. Today, we put all our data resources together. We build a big firewall. 70% of all breaches are because somebody screwed up. Okay? Don't do that. Leave the data where it is and ask questions. If you want to know that whether someone's over 21 or not, you send a question to the birth registry that says, are they over 21? And they say yes or no. Right? You don't move the birth register data to some other application. You have to know who's asking what. Are they permissioned? Are people doing these distributed attacks? There's a variety of things. So you need to actually log things. You like to use blockchain because it's popular, but any sort of secure ledger is fine. Sort of distributed secure ledgers are more secure than single point of failure ones. So the way that works is if I want to find out if you're more than 21, I present credentials that show that I have permission to ask this. Perhaps I pay a little bit. I say, I want to ask question number 21, which is pre-agreed. That's why this is called open algorithms. We had to agree what questions would be asked beforehand. The lawyers looked at it, the politicians looked at it, and we agreed it. That then is run, that question is run on the data where it's been collected, and the answer gets posted on this ledger, this blockchain, okay? So it's safe in the sense that you're not moving data around. There are copies of data everywhere. It's also safe because you can audit what's happening. So one of the big things that people forget is that in today's systems, which have these little black boxes called people, okay? Data comes, they make decisions, God knows what happens. We don't know if the judge is biased, we don't know if it's fair, lots of stuff we don't know, okay? And it's hard to find out because we don't record all of the decisions and the inputs that went into it. So we'd like to build something where we can do that. It may sound to you like this is a difficult thing to do. It's not. So for instance, Estonia did a simple version of this back in the 2000s when they had a GDP of $1,500 per head. basically what you do is you build a transport layer on the internet that's all encrypted, and it has APIs to all of the different databases that you want to be able to access. Not hard. Okay? I'm going to skip a little bit here. Go ahead. We have this stuff that we're doing to build national data systems. These are pilots in Colombia and in Senegal, as well as being able to do other things. The idea is to combine private data, telcos, banks, with public data to produce a rich census. Okay? You can see the project, opalproject.org. It's funded by the French government principally, but also the World Bank, a whole dozen people. Okay? One of the key things is that when you have an auditable system, you can have people watching what's happening. So you can audit it, have little things that ask, is this way we intended the data to be used? And so we have built in there a governance system that has all the stakeholders watching what's happening to be able to give, the goal is 24-hour feedback about whether things are correct or not. Does that make sense to people? So some of the things we're beginning to audit are fairness. So this is work by Alejandro Noriega and Michael Bacher here. So in medical systems, you don't just make a decision about things, sorry. You get more data when you can't make a good decision, right? In most social systems, they don't do that. There's a form you filled out, that's it. It's not fair for some groups, some ethnic groups, rural, urban, etc., because they have higher variance, basically, in some groups than others. So the question and answering is not good. So what we did is built adaptive systems that would vary the questions asked based on the sensitive categories, and so that you could guarantee performance across sensitive categories, urban, rural, different ethnic groups, genders, etc. The amazing thing is so for the government of Colombia, by moving from a fixed set of questions to qualify people for poverty programs to an adaptive set of programs, you can get more than almost 1 million more people benefits at no additional cost, which tells you that there's 1 million people who are getting benefits who shouldn't be getting benefits. A little bit of a political problem. Okay? So let me just sort of end there. Trust Data is that book in the middle, $12. You can read about it. Obama White House had us write a piece about it. It's in there. Secretary General had us write a piece about it. It's in there. World Economic Forum. There's also all the technical stuff if you're interested in it. Social physics is a popular thing. It's now 5 years old. As I said, it's the sort of, hey, statistics to measure culture could be good. It's why we have a census. Let's make our census more rich. That's sort of the theme there. And I'll just end there, okay? Other questions? So, a big tour. Right? But that's, the thing that I think is really a huge opportunity for you guys, right, is not just improving existing hypotheses in social science, hammering out details, figuring out stuff like that. It's actually doing things that people will implement internationally. So you have these statistical offices. Every country has a statistical office that generates the census. Some of them don't do it very often, okay, or very well. But they could do it a lot better. And they've sort of promised to do that. And what we ought to be able to do is having something that's more like continuous monitoring of social problems to provide greater transparency and accountability. That's the sort of goal that I have. And that's where the stuff that you do plugs in, right? There are people hungry for this stuff. So you ask questions about, polarization and opinion change in restaurants and things like that and causality. great questions. And by having data like this, you can begin to focus on where could you have the maximum impact. Not just as a purely theoretical thing, it's good to do the theory, but also as a practical thing. Yeah.
I have a question about, I want to see what's your opinion on accessibility of these data. I guess not many people have access to this kind of data that you showed us. Do you have any?
Yeah, so that's one of the big things that's a sort of subtext. So we have access to this data because people know who I am and that we're trustworthy. We don't typically have the data in the sense of it's not on our disk, but we have the ability to query the data, okay? So because we don't want, I mean, come on, we're a sieve. Us having data is a mistake, okay? So what we want to do, though, is be able to analyze data. And, you know, I work hard to be able to get access to all this data, and we're happy to collaborate with people. So, you know, but the sort of things that we're doing in Senegal and Colombia, now in Australia and Switzerland, are helping them build systems that will make this sort of research easy. Because if we have something that's a national system that pools data in interesting ways, it becomes relatively easy to do interesting research. And I think the poster child for this is Raj Chetty and his groups, right? Who got access, let's just say, to IRS data that had been linked over 30 years at the census tract level, right? And was able to do things, insight into all sorts of things, intergenerational mobility, policy things, that you wouldn't have been able to do without access to that. So look, it's not individual level data. That makes it some things a little difficult, but boy, having that sort of ubiquity and longevity of data lets you understand the dynamics of society in a way that has never been before. And I'll go back to the early 1800 French and English guys who believed that you could actually do this, right? Maybe we can. Wouldn't that be cool? Right? Yeah.
Could you talk more about how to combine individual level data with aggregate level data? Because nowadays, sometimes we can have a more fine-grained on how individuals make decisions on many online platforms, especially social media. Like we can collect like the history of this person's history, remarks, and everything. And you also have all this census data in an aggregated manner.
Yeah.
So how to make advantage of both sort of data and possibly combine them?
Well, so most of the data you have access to is data that people have chosen to make public. Perhaps not really informed consent, though, because they didn't understand what they were doing. And so one of the benefits of all the debates about privacy now is maybe people will understand a little better about what to make public and what to make private. And maybe people will respect the privacy a little better. Okay, so that has the bad effect that access to data for research becomes harder. Right? If, for instance, Twitter suddenly was restricted to only people that you had approved to get it, then you couldn't do a lot of the things that people do with Twitter, right? And so we're working as a society towards figuring out how to do that. What I'm showing you is what I would regard as sort of a first step, right? Which is, I think that there are safe zones that have to do with just aggregated data, which introduces methodological difficulties, right? But that there's a lot to be learned there. That's sort of my point, right? And if we could do that continually, boy, we could maybe have a better society all the way around. Individual level data, you know, hopefully people will continue to contribute data for some of these things. There is a whole sort of protocol for research, right, where you have to get informed consent in most cases. Um, you know, it's a big debate, and there's a danger. The danger is that concerns over privacy are addressed in a very blunt way that suppresses research. So, for instance, people at the national census, in personal view, not policy, just personal view, have gotten slightly crazy over differential privacy. And so they're going to add noise to all sorts of things, and in some cases that noises are going to be really bad. And a lot of scientists think that that's bad because actually the argument they're making about vulnerability of census data is seriously flawed, and it's actually pretty good. But maybe it's getting too much down in the weeds. You look like you had a question.
So thanks for the talk. And one point that you made about cross-border data extraction, extracting data for privacy purposes, keeping data where it is.
Yeah.
That is very valuable. But can you talk a bit more about these collaborations that happen across countries? And what's the role or how to improve local skills in terms of handling data? Because all countries are not at the same skill.
Yeah, for sure.
So can you elaborate more about that kind of collaboration?
So it's a huge problem. So simply making data open and available doesn't cure things if you don't have people who know how to use it. And you have to have more than that, because you have to have all the different stakeholders who are concerned with proposed policy able to comment and understand. Okay? So we do some work at helping people understand that, sort of tools for that. And you see coming out of sister labs in particular, visualization tools and interpretation tools. The thing with fairness, so what Alejandro does is he's graduating, he's starting a consulting firm, and what he does is he works with the national poverty program designers, and he builds design tools for them to help them understand the trade-offs between different, inclusion and exclusion errors, fairness, and cost. Because previously, they hadn't been able to visualize that. They just came up with some rules and said, yeah, that's pretty good, right? So he's trying to give them visualization tools. There's a lot of efforts going at around what people would call data literacy. So, for instance, I run an NGO called Data Pop, which helps educate UN staff members, among others, in data literacy. It's surprising. There's not a lot of data literacy out there, right? So try to educate them about privacy and security and insights you can have and so forth. And you can just, it's called datapopalliance.org if you want to get that. There's a number, of course, things that various multilaterals try to do. I think that it's a big problem. It's going to take the time. It's just like, literacy or numeracy took centuries in some cases, right? Hopefully this will be a lot faster than that. And I think there's some hope for this. So, like for instance, in this country, people, there was a problem with predatory lending, where people were signing documents that, basically they had to give up their house and stuff, like to buy a car, and they didn't know what was happening. And over a period of like 50 years, there was successive regulation, so that now there's a very short form that says exactly what's going to happen when you sign on the line, and the average person pretty much understands it. Now, 50 years is a long time, but having done that once, maybe we can use that as a model. And you see a number of efforts like that to try and label data agreements in understandable ways. I think it's just a tough problem because you have to educate large numbers of people, and the target changes. So, the advice I would give you about Facebook today is different than the advice I would give you in 2010, right? although I wrote about it then when they changed and said, this is not good. So, yeah, it's difficult. No good answers. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Fascinating talk. I'm sort of curious. So I come from political science,
Yeah.
and
I thought you might be interested.
so, I guess part of what I'm sort of curious about is whether you're at all concerned that you're encouraging governments to build up capacity and information on their citizens that they might not use.
So this is one of the big things, right? Is that, how do you get the advantages of this? And the advantages are tremendous. You folks live really nice lives compared to the non-weird people, right? Whose babies die young, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? On the other hand, having data resources like that is way scary, okay? So you have this conundrum, okay? There's a couple points. Let me do the one that you won't like, but is probably the actual answer, is that you get the UN and the World Bank and UNESCO and all that to sort of agree what's good and what's not good, and we try to beat up the ones that do it badly, and okay, so that's the political answer. You won't like that. I agree with you, not to like that. So this OPAL thing is interesting. This open algorithms thing is interesting because what happens, the government does not have, in most cases, this sort of level of data. It's in private hands. So let's take some random country in the middle of nowhere, right? You will have a telco that is based in France. It'll have a medical system where the people were trained, London or something like that. It will have a bank that's owned in Spain, okay? So it's an agreement among those international elements to share certain levels of data. Now, what will happen in a bad case? The government will come in and try and take the data or take control of it. But at least you have the fact that this is based in Spain and France and London. And I've talked to these guys, right? They've had this decision. For instance, what is it? I forget, I'm blocking. The Vodafone guy, right? Had this decision in Egypt when there was a revolution. And at first, he just turned everything off. He's like, no, can't do that, right? But eventually, there was a sort of a quid pro quo or a deal where they were able to turn it back on and feel halfway good about it. Situation evolved, things like that. Now, you may not agree with it, but the point is that a lot of critical services depended on having a working telco system, right? So it's scary stuff, but the world is sort of moving towards how to do this. So I see my role and the board I'm on for the UN in trying to find a design that is most resistant to abuse, but yet gives the greatest utility, right? So you want to make it you want to make it hard for the bad guys to use this in a bad way, okay? But you don't want the kids to die, okay? So that's your trade-off. You have to realize with the bad guys, they can go door to door with guns. So that's the cost barrier you have to hit, right? If it's harder to misuse the data than to go door to door with guns, you've done a good job, right? That sounds maybe a little weird, but you know what? This is like real politic, right?
I'm familiar with the language.
Yeah, okay. So we don't have to be perfect. We have to be good enough that the data doesn't actually get abused. And it's not a trivial thing, right? The other thing and this is very political, is you have to notice that the things that are being installed in different countries have very different philosophies than you and I might have, right? So the providers of those services are not part of our conversation and don't have the same sort of fear of the strong state. And so we have a sort of contentious situation. And I think, defining what best practice is and trying to make that popular and make all the providers of software follow that seems like a good path. That's why I work with Eurostat. Europe does it, and all the software there does it. Good. If we can get Microsoft to do it, who's actually on board about this, right? Then the default things you buy. IBM's on board with it. IBM's the sponsor, right? They're very much on board with this because they're aware of it. Is it going to happen? Complicated, right? Good question, though, right? Other things? No? Okay, good.
All right. Thanks, Sandy.
Yep. Good.
So we have dinner at Meat Hall, where we met the first day, and Sandy has also agreed to join us. See her see them at the restaurant. So we have to be the reservation is at 6. So plan to be there by 6.
Sure. Okay. I don't. Most countries don't actually know right? So it hasn't, it's studied. There might be ways of
Because everybody goes over.
I don't understand but like when we go there, does someone take the order of it?
So we have this inequality.
Yeah.
I don't think it's able to.
I know, but that one is only basic there. And that one's
Actually, might,
in the garage.
might refer you to India.
They'd be doing that at the counter anyway.
Because there's so much organization.
Yeah.
There is here. But it's more sort of national thing.
Oh, no, I agree.
Just a large population.
Place
and
some,
then
my son has fully
that they
based,
have.
like the same belief is, same company, or same people.
Sorry.
So when I taught,
There's a lot of things that are sort of, important finding things
Not
that
because
there's no data research.
Exactly.
It's okay.
Yeah, so it's like, can we do anything to create that hype?
Yeah. Well, that's